Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back to the grandeur and might of the Roman Empire. Picture the colossal Colosseum, the intricate aqueducts, the bustling forum, and the vast network of roads stretching across an empire that spanned continents. It's a vision of power, innovation, and order, a civilization that, in many ways, laid the foundation for much of the Western world. But beneath this magnificent facade, powering almost every aspect of Roman life, was a system so pervasive, so fundamental, yet so utterly inhumane, that it's almost impossible to truly grasp. Tonight, we're going to talk about what slavery was really like in the Roman Empire. And let me tell you, if you were an enslaved person in ancient Rome, you probably wouldn't survive this. At least, not with your spirit unbroken. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, from the moment you arrive in this ancient world. Perhaps as a captive, you'd quickly learn that Roman society didn't just have slavery, it was deeply dependent on it. This wasn't a peripheral institution, it was the very engine of the Roman economy, the foundation of its social structure, and a pervasive, inescapable fact of daily life. You wouldn't see it as an unusual or immoral practice, it was simply how things were. Imagine every aspect of your life. If you were a Roman citizen, the food you ate, grown in fields tilled by enslaved labor, the clothes you wore, perhaps woven by enslaved hands, the roads you walked on, built by enslaved people, the houses you lived in, constructed and maintained by enslaved workers, the baths you visited, cleaned and operated by enslaved attendants, even your education, your entertainment, and your personal grooming relied heavily on the forced labor of millions. It's like an entire civilization running on a silent, vast, and invisible workforce, without whom the entire structure would simply collapse. The sheer scale of this dependence is staggering, while exact figures are debated by historians. It's estimated that at certain points, particularly during the late Republic and early Empire, enslaved people might have constituted anywhere from 20% to 40% or even more in some urban centers of the total population of Italy. That means that everywhere you looked, in the streets, in the fields, in the shops, you would encounter people who were not considered persons in the legal sense, but rather property, instruments with voices. As one Roman writer famously put it, it's a chilling descriptor. Isn't it just an implement that happens to be able to talk back? This dependence wasn't just economic. It was deeply ingrained in the Roman mindset. Roman philosophers and thinkers, despite their intellectual prowess, largely accepted slavery as a natural and necessary part of the social order. They debated the management of enslaved people, but rarely the morality of the institution itself. For them, it was an established fact of existence, a fundamental aspect of their way of life. This acceptance made it all the more insidious, as it permeated every layer of society without significant challenge from within. For centuries, one mainstream historical fact that illustrates this dependence is the vast agricultural estates latifundia in Italy, particularly during the Republican period. These massive farms, producing grain, olives, and wine, were worked predominantly by large gangs of enslaved laborers, often living in harsh conditions. Without this forced labor, Rome simply could not have fed its massive urban population or sustained its military campaigns. The very bread on a Roman's table was often a direct product of someone else's unending toil. A quirky or fringe tidbit, is that even relatively poor Roman households often aspired to own at least one enslaved person. However humble their duties, it was a status symbol, a mark of even the slightest prosperity, demonstrating your participation in the Roman way of life. Imagine a society where even the middle-class citizen felt they needed to own another human being to feel truly successful. It's a sobering thought. Historians still argue whether Rome's reliance on slavery ultimately hindered its technological innovation, as cheap, forced labor often negated the need for developing labor-saving devices. Why invent a machine when you have endless human muscle? This dependence, for all its economic benefits, might have been a hidden brake on progress. So, you're in ancient Rome, and you've understood that slavery isn't just present, it's everywhere. But how did you, or anyone else, actually become a slave in this colossal system? It wasn't always a dramatic, Hollywood-esque capture on a battlefield. While that certainly happened, the pathways into servitude were numerous, often subtle, and always devastating for the individual. The Roman system was constantly hungry for new labor, and it had many ways of feeding that hunger. Imagine being born into slavery. This was perhaps the most common way to become enslaved in the Roman Empire. If your mother was an enslaved person, you were born into bondage. Regardless of your father's status or whether he was free, you inherited your mother's condition, meaning entire generations could be born and die without ever knowing freedom. This created a self-perpetuating system, a grim inheritance passed down from parent to child, often for many centuries. It's like being born with a permanent, unbreakable contract, signed by someone else, for your entire life. Another primary source of enslaved people was, indeed, war and conquest. As the Roman Republic expanded and then the empire consolidated its vast territories, successful military campaigns brought in immense numbers of captives. Entire populations of conquered cities and regions could be enslaved and brought back to Rome or other parts of the empire to be sold. You might be a farmer from Gaul, a scholar from Greece, or a warrior from Dacia. And suddenly, after the dust of battle settles, you find yourself marched in chains towards a slave market, stripped of your identity and your liberty. This was a brutal, direct consequence of Rome's military might, constantly replenishing the ranks of its unfree labor force, beyond birth and conquest. There were other, more insidious ways to fall into slavery. Piracy was a persistent problem in the Mediterranean, and countless individuals were abducted from coastal areas and sold into bondage. You could be a simple fisherman, snatched from your boat, or a merchant traveler, captured on the high seas, and your fate would instantly change. Imagine a quick trip across the water turning into a life of servitude overnight. Economic hardship also played a role. Though direct debt bondage, where you sold yourself or your children into slavery to repay a debt, became less common for Roman citizens over time. However, exposure of unwanted infants was a practice, and these abandoned children could be picked up and raised as enslaved people, effectively becoming property from their earliest days. You could be left on a hillside as an infant, and the next person to find you owned you. This highlights a chilling lack of protection for the most vulnerable members of society. One mainstream historical fact that underscores the scale of acquisition through conquest is the capture of enslaved people during the Punic Wars or the Gallic Wars. For instance, Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul alone resulted in hundreds of thousands of enslaved captives being brought into the Roman world, profoundly impacting the demographics and economy of Italy. These vast influxes of new labor profoundly shaped Roman society, providing the manpower for its grand projects and private households. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that people could theoretically sell themselves into slavery in extreme circumstances, though this was rare and legally complex. Often done to escape dire poverty or to gain access to food and shelter, it was an act of ultimate desperation, trading freedom for mere survival. Imagine having to make that impossible choice. Historians still argue whether the sheer diversity of origins of enslaved people contributed to or hindered their ability to organize resistance, as shared language and cultural background could be a powerful unifying force. But dispersal made it difficult. The pathways into Roman slavery were many, but the destination was always the same, a life defined by the will of another. So, you've grasped how people became enslaved in Rome, often through birth or conquest, but here's where it gets even more complex and in some ways, even more unsettling the varying slave experiences. It's a common misconception that all Roman slavery was monolithic, a single, undifferentiated hell of chains and whips. The reality, you'd quickly discover, was far more nuanced. A spectrum of suffering that ranged from horrific brutality to, in rare cases, a life that might sometimes seem superficially comfortable, but was always fundamentally devoid of freedom. Imagine being thrust into this system. Your life's trajectory, your daily existence, and your potential for survival or manumission freedom depended almost entirely on two critical factors: your master's temperament and your assigned role. A cruel, capricious master could make your life an unending nightmare. Regardless of your duties, a benevolent by Roman standards. Of course, master might offer a comparatively less brutal existence, but you were still entirely at their mercy, their property to do with as they pleased. This fundamental power imbalance was the constant, unifying thread of all enslaved experiences. Your assigned role was equally determinative. Were you destined for the back-breaking labor of the mines or the meticulous, sometimes privileged, work within a wealthy household? Were you a gladiatorial fighter, risking your life for entertainment, or a highly educated scribe, serving an intellectual master? These roles dictated your living conditions, your diet, your workload, and the very air you breathed. It's like a lottery where all the prizes are bad, but some are definitely worse than others. The sheer diversity of tasks performed by enslaved people is astounding. They weren't just agricultural laborers. They were also teachers, doctors, accountants, architects, artists, musicians, hairdressers, prostitutes, gladiators, shopkeepers, police officers, and even civil servants. This meant that an enslaved person with specialized skills might find themselves in a position of relative trust and responsibility, perhaps even managing other enslaved people or significant aspects of their master's business. This could lead to better food, clothing, and living quarters, sometimes even a degree of social interaction that was otherwise denied. One mainstream historical fact that showcases this variety is the existence of highly skilled and educated slaves. Many Greeks, particularly those captured during Rome's conquest of the Hellenistic world, were highly educated individuals. They became tutors for Roman children, scribes, librarians, and even physicians. Their intellectual prowess made them valuable assets, elevating their status compared to, say, someone condemned to work in a quarry. Their value often afforded them certain privileges, but it never erased their fundamental status as property. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is the concept of a peculium. This was a fund of money or property that a master might allow an enslaved person to accumulate, often through gifts or by allowing them to keep a portion of their earnings from certain tasks. While legally still belonging to the master, it offered the enslaved person a glimmer of hope for future freedom by buying their manumission, or at least a sense of limited agency. Imagine working tirelessly, saving every scrap, just for the chance to buy the right to own yourself. It was a cruel form of hope, but hope nonetheless. Historians still argue whether the peculium was a genuine path to upward mobility for enslaved individuals, or simply a clever management tool employed by masters to incentivize productivity and reduce the likelihood of rebellion. Without fundamentally altering the oppressive nature of the system, was it a carrot or just a slightly less painful stick? The range of experiences was vast, but the underlying vulnerability was universal. You were always just one bad decision, one cruel master, or one unlucky twist of fate away from the bottom rung. Given the vast spectrum of slave experiences, your life as an enslaved person in the Roman Empire would be profoundly shaped by your physical location. This brings us to the stark contrast between urban versus rural slavery. The very air you breathed, the work you performed, and the dangers you faced would differ dramatically depending on whether you found yourself within the bustling, crowded confines of a Roman city or out in the vast, open, and often brutal countryside. Imagine finding yourself in a large city like Rome itself. As an urban slave, your life would often be one of greater diversity in tasks, and, potentially, marginally better living conditions. You might be a domestic servant in a wealthy household, a shop assistant in a taberna shop, a craftsman in a workshop, or even an imperial slave working on public projects or in government offices. The work could be demanding, certainly, but it often involved more specialized skills, less raw physical exertion than agricultural labor, and generally, more interaction with various strata of Roman society. You might live within the master's house, or in a small room or cubicle nearby, rather than in large, barrack-style housing. The urban environment also offered a different kind of anonymity, a chance to blend into the crowds, and, perhaps, more opportunities for limited social interaction or even the chance to earn that peculium we talked about earlier. You'd be exposed to different people, different ideas, and, perhaps, a greater awareness of the possibilities of freedom. However, urban slavery was still slavery. You were always property, always at the mercy of your master, and always subject to punishment. A cruel master in the city could be just as brutal as one in the countryside, and the close quarters of urban life could make escape difficult. Now, shift your perspective to the vast Roman countryside. As a rural slave, your existence would typically be far more harsh and relentless. You would likely be engaged in grueling agricultural labor on large estates, cultivating grain, olives, or grapes. Your days would be long, from dawn till dusk, spent under the hot sun, with little respite. The work was often monotonous, physically exhausting, and performed in large gangs, with overseers driving you to meet quotas. Your living conditions would often be rudimentary barracks-style housing, meager food, and little to no personal space. It's like comparing working in a bustling office building to being a field hand on a massive, unforgiving farm, only with the added layer of involuntary servitude. The brutality of rural slavery was often amplified by the sheer scale of the operations and the distance from the public eye. Masters or their overseers in remote areas could exercise absolute power with little oversight, leading to widespread abuse. Runaways from rural estates faced immense challenges, with few places to hide and a higher likelihood of being caught and punished severely. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this distinction is the use of slave gangs familia rusticae on agricultural estates. These large groups of enslaved people were typically managed by an overseer, often also an enslaved person, who was empowered to maintain discipline, sometimes with extreme violence. These large-scale operations were designed for maximum efficiency and profit, often at the cost of the enslaved individual's well-being. Their lives were simply a means to an end agricultural output. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that while urban enslaved people might have more varied diets, often leftovers from their master's table, rural enslaved people's diets were usually far more monotonous, consisting mainly of grains like barley or spelt olives, figs, and cheap wine. Meat was a rare luxury. Imagine eating essentially the same bland, coarse meal, day in and day out, fueling endless hours of back-breaking labor. It's a diet for survival, not enjoyment. Historians still argue whether the perceived better conditions of urban slavery led to less resistance or rebellion among urban enslaved populations compared to their rural counterparts, or if the nature of urban resistance simply manifested in more subtle, less overt forms. The distinction between urban and rural life was not just geographical, it was often the difference between a difficult life and an utterly desperate one. So, you've understood the harsh realities of rural slavery. Now, let's turn our gaze back to the city, to the seemingly better life of household slaves. While their existence might appear more comfortable than those toiling in the fields or mines, you'd quickly learn that this relative comfort was a thin veneer over a constant, gnawing vulnerability. Your proximity to your master meant your life, however luxurious on the surface, was still entirely at the mercy of their whims, moods, and often their darkest impulses. Imagine yourself as a domestic slave in a wealthy Roman domus house. Your days would be filled with a myriad of tasks: cleaning, cooking, serving meals, dressing your master or mistress, running errands, accompanying children, acting as a personal assistant, or even managing other household enslaved people. The work could be demanding and require specialized skills, but it often took place indoors, away from the elements, and might even involve interacting with the master's family in a seemingly personal way. You might wear finer clothes, eat better food, often leftovers from the family table, and sleep in more comfortable quarters than your rural counterparts. It's like living in a grand mansion, but you're perpetually on call, never truly off duty. However, this proximity to power was a double-edged sword. While it offered potential for influence or even manumission, it also exposed you to the full force of your master's arbitrary authority. A bad mood, a perceived slight, a minor mistake, or even just a bored master could trigger severe punishment. Roman law gave masters absolute power over their enslaved people, including the right to inflict corporal punishment, torture, or even death, with very few legal repercussions. Imagine knowing that a single angry glance from your master could escalate into a brutal beating, and there would be no one to whom you could appeal. This personal vulnerability was a constant companion. You might be a trusted cook, admired for your culinary skills, but one burnt meal or one misplaced word could change your fortunes instantly. You might be a nursemaid, caring for your master's children with genuine affection, yet still be sold away at a moment's notice if the family's finances changed, or if your mistress grew jealous. Your life was never your own, your future never secure, despite any apparent comfort. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this vulnerability is the power of the dominus master. Roman law, specifically the lex Aquilia, categorized enslaved people as property, much like livestock or tools. This meant that if an enslaved person was injured or killed by someone other than their owner, the owner could seek damages for the property loss, not for the harm done to a human being. The enslaved person had no legal standing to defend themselves or seek justice for wrongs committed against them by their owner. It was a stark legal reality. You simply did not exist as a person in the eyes of the law. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is the concept of a noxa or noxal surrender, if an enslaved person caused damage or injury to someone else. The owner could either pay compensation for the damage or simply hand over the offending enslaved person to the injured party. This highlights that the enslaved person was merely an object through which compensation was rendered. Rather than an individual accountable for their actions, imagine accidentally breaking someone's vase, and your owner just hands you over to them as compensation. It's a grim form of accountability. Historians still argue whether the apparent trust and intimacy sometimes shown between masters and household enslaved people, as depicted in some Roman literature, truly reflects genuine affection, or was simply a pragmatic relationship designed to ensure loyalty and productivity within a fundamentally unequal power dynamic. Was it a form of disguised affection, or simply a sophisticated form of manipulation? The luxury of the household slave was always a precarious illusion, dependent on the unpredictable will of those who owned them, while the household slave navigated the volatile whims of their master. A far more chilling reality awaited those destined for the absolute lowest rungs of Roman servitude, the mine and quarry slaves. If you found yourself in this category, your existence would be defined by brutal, unceasing labor, horrific conditions, and a life expectancy so tragically short that it was often considered a death sentence. This wasn't merely harsh, it was an infernal, living nightmare from which few ever truly emerged. Imagine descending into the suffocating darkness of a Roman mine. The air would be thick with dust, the stench of sweat and human waste overwhelming. You'd be working naked or in rags, hunched over in cramped, claustrophobic tunnels, chipping away at rock face with primitive tools. The only light would come from flickering oil lamps, casting dancing shadows that made the already dangerous work even more perilous. Collapses were common, and rock falls, drowning from underground springs, and suffocation from toxic gases were ever-present threats. It's like working in a perpetually collapsing cave. With no escape and no hope, the work was relentless. Shifts could last for many hours, sometimes around the clock. With minimal breaks for meager food and water, you'd be driven by overseers, often themselves enslaved, wielding whips to ensure maximum output. The sheer physical exertion, combined with poor nutrition and constant exposure to dust and damp, would quickly take its toll on your body. Your lungs would burn, your muscles would ache constantly, and your skin would be lacerated by rocks and tools. This wasn't work designed for survival. It was work designed for consumption, squeezing every last ounce of labor from your body before it simply gave out. Quarries, while perhaps open to the sky, offered little respite. Here, you'd be engaged in the back-breaking work of extracting massive blocks of stone, often under the scorching sun. Hauling, cutting, and shaping these immense weights demanded extraordinary strength and endurance, pushing your body to its absolute limits. Accidents were frequent, crushing injuries from falling blocks, limbs severed by heavy tools, or falls from precarious ledges. The constant noise of hammers and chisels would be deafening, adding another layer of torment to your existence. One mainstream historical fact that underscores the horror of this existence is that condemnation to the mine's damnatio ad metalla was a common punishment for serious crimes, effectively a death sentence for criminals, as well as for enslaved people who proved rebellious or troublesome. Being sent to the mines meant a slow, agonizing demise. This fact alone speaks volumes about the perceived brutality of this particular form of servitude. You weren't expected to survive long, and your labor was literally extracted until your last breath. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that, Ironically, the Roman government sometimes owned and operated large mines and quarries. These were public slaves, more on them in the next section, but their conditions were often no better, and sometimes worse, than those in private hands, as the state's primary concern was profit and output, not individual welfare. Imagine being owned by the very empire that claims to bring order, only to be worked to death in a dark hole. It's a bitter joke. Isn't it historians still argue whether the extreme brutality of mine and quarry slavery was a deliberate strategy to dehumanize and break the spirit of rebellious populations, or simply an unfortunate but accepted consequence of prioritizing resource extraction at any human cost? Was it terror, or just pure pragmatism? Your life in the mines or quarries would be a testament to human cruelty. A desperate fight for breath in the dark, with death as your only true release, having glimpsed the absolute depths of human suffering in the mines. Let's turn to a slightly different, though still fundamentally unfree, experience, that of public and imperial slaves. If you found yourself serving the Roman state or the emperor directly, your life would be markedly different from the household servant or the quarry laborer, while still property. These positions often offered a unique blend of responsibility, stability, and even a strange form of prestige, a stark contrast to the brutal anonymity of chattel slavery. Imagine being owned not by an individual, but by the Roman state itself, or by the emperor's vast personal household. As a public slave, servus publicus, you might be assigned to a wide array of duties crucial to the functioning of the city or the empire. You could be working on public works projects, but instead of the mines, perhaps maintaining aqueducts, repairing roads, or cleaning public baths. You might serve in government offices, assisting magistrates, maintaining records, or even performing clerical tasks. For the emperor's own vast familia Caesaris imperial household slaves, your duties could range from managing imperial estates to serving in the emperor's personal bureaucracy, or even as highly skilled artisans. These roles often demanded literacy, specialized skills, and a level of trust, because you were working for the state or the emperor. There was often a greater degree of job security, at least theoretically, than with a private master who could sell you on a whim. Your living conditions might be more stable, your food more consistent, and you might even receive a regular peculium to encourage diligence. Some public slaves held positions of significant responsibility, managing entire departments or large budgets, essentially acting as civil servants. Despite their unfree status, it's like being a highly skilled, incredibly valuable government employee. But you don't actually get paid, and you can't quit. However, it's crucial to remember that this better life was still one of slavery. You could not simply walk away. You had no legal rights, and you were still subject to the whims of the officials or emperors you served. A change in imperial administration, a new policy, or simply falling out of favor could dramatically alter your circumstances, leading to demotion, reassignment to harsher duties, or even sale to a less desirable master. Your freedom was always an aspiration, not a given. One mainstream historical fact that highlights the importance of public slaves is their role in maintaining Roman infrastructure, the complex network of Roman roads, bridges, and aqueducts, feats of engineering that still stand today, required constant maintenance and repair. Much of this continuous labor was performed by public slaves, whose unseen efforts were fundamental to the empire's logistical and administrative efficiency. They were the silent cogs in the magnificent machine of Roman power. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some public slaves were effectively state executioners or torturers. While a grim role, It highlights the diversity of tasks and the direct involvement of enslaved people in the machinery of state power. Imagine being forced into such a role, having to inflict pain or death on others, knowing that your own life was just as expendable. It's a chilling reminder that even high-status roles could be deeply morally compromised. Historians still argue whether the increased stability and occasional prestige offered to public and imperial slaves fostered a greater sense of loyalty to the state, thereby reducing their inclination for rebellion, or if it simply created a more subtle form of psychological oppression where the illusion of status masked the reality of absolute bondage. Was it a shrewd management strategy, or just a slightly fancier cage? Your life as a public slave might have been less physically brutal, but it was still a life utterly devoid of true autonomy, serving a master who was an entire empire. Whether you were a public slave managing aqueducts or a household slave managing your master's wardrobe, your value, and sometimes your pathway to a marginally better life, was often determined by your education and specialized skills. In a society as complex as Rome, simple brute force wasn't enough. There was a constant demand for intelligent, trained, and talented individuals, and many enslaved people filled these crucial roles, demonstrating a surprising range of expertise. Imagine being an enslaved person with a particular skill. Perhaps you were captured from a Greek city, already literate and educated in philosophy or rhetoric. Or maybe you had a knack for numbers and could manage accounts. Or perhaps you had an artistic talent, able to paint frescoes or sculpt statues. Your master, recognizing this valuable asset, would likely invest in developing your skills further, seeing you not just as labor, but as a profitable investment. You might be sent to learn a trade, tutored in a language, or even trained in a specific art. It's like being a raw diamond that gets polished, not for your own benefit, but to make your owner richer. This focus on specialized skills meant that some enslaved people held positions of considerable responsibility and influence, even over free Romans. You might be a highly respected physician, attending to your master's family and even other wealthy citizens. Though you remained enslaved, you could be an architect, designing grand villas, or an engineer, overseeing construction projects. You might be a teacher, imparting knowledge to the children of Rome's elite, including those who would one day be your masters. This created a strange social dynamic where enslaved individuals could possess intellectual superiority or practical mastery over their owners, yet still be legally classified as property. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this is the prevalence of enslaved doctors, medici servi, and teachers pedagogi. Many Roman households, particularly wealthy ones, employed enslaved physicians to attend to their health needs, and enslaved teachers to educate their children. These individuals were often Greek, bringing with them the advanced medical and philosophical knowledge of the Hellenistic world. Their expertise made them invaluable, often granting them privileges not afforded to other enslaved people, such as better food, living quarters, and, sometimes, a greater chance of manumission. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is the existence of enslaved people who specialized in hairdressing and cosmetics. Imagine an enslaved barber or beautician, intimately involved in the daily grooming rituals of their wealthy Roman master or mistress. They would possess intricate knowledge of styles, perfumes, and even rudimentary cosmetic chemistry. Their skill was highly valued, as a Roman's appearance was crucial to their social standing. It's a bit like having a celebrity stylist, but they can't leave when their shift is over. Historians still argue whether the granting of educational opportunities and specialized roles to enslaved individuals was a benevolent aspect of Roman slavery, designed to foster skill and potentially lead to manumission, or if it was primarily a cynical strategy by masters to maximize their economic utility and control. Creating a class of elite enslaved people who would help manage the broader system. Was it a pathway to something better? Or just a smarter way to exploit labor regardless? If you were an enslaved person with a valuable skill, your life might be less physically demanding, but the fundamental reality of your bondage remained. Your talent was your master's asset, not your personal freedom. So, some enslaved people held valuable skills, but for many, a darker reality lay just beneath the surface of their existence: sexual exploitation and vulnerability. If you were an enslaved person in the Roman Empire, especially a woman, your body was not your own. It was a commodity, subject to the desires and whims of your owner, and you possessed virtually no legal recourse or protection against sexual abuse. This was a grim and pervasive reality that permeated all levels of Roman society where slavery existed. Imagine being an enslaved woman within a Roman household. You might be assigned as a chambermaid, a bath attendant, or even a personal servant to the mistress. Your proximity to the men of the household, the master, his sons, or even male guests, placed you in an incredibly vulnerable position. There were no laws protecting enslaved people from sexual assault by their owners or anyone else with their owner's permission. Your master had absolute power, and that power extended to your body. Consent, as you understand it today, simply did not exist for enslaved individuals. It's like being trapped in a house where the rules of personal boundaries simply don't apply to you. This exploitation wasn't limited to private households. Enslaved individuals, both male and female, were often forced into prostitution. Owners could and did rent out their enslaved people as prostitutes in brothels, or even use them to entertain guests at private gatherings. These individuals, known as meretrices for women or pueri delicati for young men, often used for sexual favors, had no agency over their own bodies. Their earnings, if any, often went directly to their owners. Imagine being forced into such a degrading profession, knowing that your body was being used for profit and pleasure, with no hope of escape. The children born from these exploitative relationships were automatically considered enslaved. If an enslaved woman became pregnant by her master or another free Roman, the child inherited the mother's status and was born into bondage. This created a perverse incentive for some masters, as it provided a continuous supply of new enslaved labor without the need for purchase. It's a chilling cycle of exploitation, where even new life was automatically claimed as property. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this pervasive vulnerability is the complete lack of legal protection for enslaved people against sexual abuse. Roman law did not recognize enslaved individuals as having personhood, and therefore, they could not be victims of crimes like rape in the same way free citizens could. An act of sexual violence against an enslaved person was viewed, at best, as damage to property, not as a violation of a human being. This legal vacuum left enslaved people utterly exposed and defenseless. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some Roman gravestones for enslaved individuals, particularly those who were pueri delicati, sometimes showed affectionate epitaphs from their owners, while seemingly touching. Historians still argue whether these epitaphs genuinely reflect affection and a complex relationship, or if they were merely a way for owners to display their wealth and refined tastes, or even to legitimize relationships that were fundamentally exploitative. Imagine getting a fancy tombstone from someone who literally owned your body. It's a grim form of posthumous branding. Historians still debate whether the pervasive sexual exploitation of enslaved people was a deliberate tool of control and dehumanization, designed to break their will, or simply an unfortunate but common byproduct of absolute power in a society that normalized sexual exploitation of the vulnerable. It's hard to separate the two for many enslaved individuals. The threat of sexual violence was a constant, terrifying reality, a daily reminder that their bodies were not their own, but merely instruments for others' gratification or profit. Despite the grim realities of exploitation, and against all odds, enslaved people in the Roman Empire often attempted to forge connections, leading to surprisingly resilient family life and relationships. While these bonds were incredibly fragile, constantly threatened by sale or separation, they represent a testament to the enduring human need for connection and belonging, even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. Imagine being an enslaved person and falling in love, or finding solace with another enslaved individual. You might form a contubernium, a de facto marriage between enslaved people, recognized by custom within the enslaved community. But with no legal standing in Roman law, your children, as you know, would automatically inherit your enslaved status. This meant that while you could share affection, comfort, and perhaps even hope, your family could be ripped apart at any moment. Your master could sell your spouse to another household, or your children to a distant estate, with no legal right for you to object. It's like building a sandcastle on the beach, knowing the tide could come in and wash it away at any moment. Despite this precariousness, these bonds were immensely important for survival and emotional well-being. Having a partner or children could provide a sense of purpose, a reason to endure, and a small, private sphere of dignity. Enslaved parents tried to protect their children, to teach them what they could, and to instill in them a sense of resilience. These relationships formed the bedrock of enslaved communities, offering mutual support and shared comfort in a harsh world. Enslaved families might live together, often in cramped quarters within their master's household or on agricultural estates. They would share their meager resources, support each other through illness, and mourn together when separations inevitably occurred. These informal family units were often the only true source of solace and human connection in a life otherwise defined by forced labor and absolute submission. One mainstream historical fact that underscores the vulnerability of these family units is the frequent sale of enslaved people. Owners regularly bought and sold enslaved individuals, often without regard for existing family ties. An enslaved person could be sold due to their master's financial needs, as punishment, or simply to adjust the workforce. This meant that entire families could be shattered with a single transaction, illustrating the complete disregard for the personal bonds formed by enslaved people. Imagine knowing that any day, your loved ones could just disappear, sold to someone you'd never know, never to be seen again. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some masters, recognizing the value of a stable workforce, might informally allow and even encourage contubernia among their enslaved people. This wasn't out of benevolence, but a pragmatic recognition that enslaved people with family ties might be less likely to run away and more productive if they had a modicum of personal stability. Imagine your master giving you a small hut for your family, not because he cares about your happiness, but because he thinks it makes you work harder. It's a calculated form of allowance. Historians still argue whether the formation of these informal family units among enslaved people, despite their legal fragility, ultimately contributed to the resilience and cultural continuity of the enslaved population, or if they primarily served to bind individuals more tightly to the system, making it harder for them to resist or escape due to fear of abandoning loved ones. Was it a lifeline or another chain? Regardless, the simple act of forming a family was a profound act of defiance and hope against a system designed to deny basic human dignity. You've seen the fragility of family bonds, always at the whim of the master. But for some enslaved individuals, there was a glimmer of hope for a different kind of bond, the bond of self-ownership. This brings us to manumission, the elusive path to freedom and its limitations. While freedom was certainly possible for enslaved people in the Roman Empire, it was by no means a simple or guaranteed process, and even when granted, it often came with significant strings attached. Imagine dreaming of freedom, of a life where your body and your labor were finally your own. Manumission, the act of being formally released from slavery, was indeed a feature of Roman society. Unlike some other ancient slave systems, Roman law made provisions for manumission, and it happened with considerable frequency, particularly in the later Republic and early Empire. This was often seen as a mark of a good master, or a reward for loyal service, or sometimes as a practical way to manage aging or unproductive enslaved people. There were several ways an enslaved person could gain their freedom. The most common was through a formal declaration by the master, either in their will testamento or by a public ceremony before a magistrate vindicta, less formal methods, like a simple declaration in front of friends, also existed. Though their legal standing could be shakier, you might also save up your peculium, that small fund we talked about, and literally buy your freedom from your master. A powerful, albeit often lifelong, struggle to accumulate enough money to purchase yourself. It's like paying off a mortgage, but the property is you. However, freedom, when it came, wasn't absolute. A formally manumitted enslaved person became a libertas freedman or liberta freedwoman. They gained Roman citizenship, but often with limitations. They usually owed certain duties to their former master, now their patron. These duties could include a certain number of days of labor each year, financial contributions, or simply continued loyalty and respect. If a freed person failed in these duties, their former master could, in some cases, even revoke their freedom. Imagine finally getting your freedom papers, only to find out you still have to show up for work a few days a week at your old boss's house, and they can technically fire you from being free. Furthermore, social stigma often followed freed individuals. While legally free and citizens, they rarely achieved the same social standing as freeborn Romans, particularly those from noble families. Their origins as enslaved people could be a mark against them, limiting their opportunities for marriage, political office, or social advancement. Their children, however, were born free and without these specific obligations, allowing for multi-generational upward mobility. Though it was still a difficult climb, one mainstream historical fact that highlights the frequency of manumission is the Augustan laws on manumission, such as the Lex Fufia Caninia and the Lex Aelia Sentia. These laws, enacted by Emperor Augustus, actually sought to limit the number of manumissions. Fearing that too many new citizens from enslaved backgrounds could dilute the purity of the Roman citizenry or destabilize society, the very need for these laws demonstrates how common manumission had become prior to their implementation. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that masters sometimes manumitted enslaved people in their wills, often upon their own death. This could be a genuine act of benevolence, or it could be a way to avoid supporting aging or infirm enslaved people in their later years. Shifting the burden of their care, imagine hoping your master dies soon, not just for your freedom, but to avoid becoming a financial drain. It's a dark twist on inheritance. Historians still argue whether the Roman system of manumission was a significant mitigating factor against the overall harshness of slavery, offering a genuine path to integration into Roman society. Or if it was primarily a strategic tool for masters to control their enslaved workforce and maintain social stability without truly challenging the fundamental injustice of the institution itself. Was it a carrot to prevent rebellion, or a genuine act of mercy for the enslaved? It was a dream, a hope, but one that came with conditions, and, often, continued obligations. So, you've grasped the bittersweet nature of manumission, a freedom that came with duties. This leads us to the fundamental core of Roman slavery, the legal status and rights, or lack thereof, that defined an enslaved person's entire existence. For all the variations in experience, from the pampered household servant to the condemned mine worker, the one unchanging reality was this in the eyes of Roman law: you were not a person, you were property. Imagine being classified as a res, a thing, an object. This wasn't a metaphorical distinction, it was a profound legal reality that stripped you of all fundamental human rights. You couldn't own property beyond that precarious peculium that legally belonged to your master. You couldn't legally marry. You couldn't testify in court against your master. And you couldn't initiate legal proceedings for your own protection. Your identity was entirely subsumed by your status as someone else's possession. It's like being a very expensive, talking piece of furniture. This legal non-personhood meant that any harm inflicted upon you was seen as damage to your owner's property, not as a crime against you. If someone else injured or killed you, your owner could sue for the loss of their asset, similar to suing for a damaged animal. You had no inherent right to bodily integrity or life. This legal framework was the bedrock upon which the entire edifice of Roman slavery was built. Providing masters with almost absolute power over their enslaved workforce, while some Roman legal texts occasionally discuss the natural rights of all humans to freedom. These philosophical musings rarely translated into practical legal protections for enslaved people. Roman law was pragmatic and heavily favored the property owner. It was a system designed to facilitate the ownership and exploitation of human beings on a massive scale, not to protect their individual dignity. One mainstream historical fact that chillingly illustrates this legal reality is the right of a master dominus to inflict any punishment, including death, upon their enslaved person, while later imperial decrees, particularly from the 1st century CE onwards, like those of Emperor Claudius or Hadrian, began to introduce some very limited restrictions on excessive cruelty or the abandonment of sick enslaved people. These were often aimed at preventing public disorder or economic waste. Rather than genuinely protecting the enslaved individual, a master who killed their own enslaved person faced no murder charges, as they were simply destroying their own property. Imagine being entirely defenseless against arbitrary violence. With the law on your oppressor's side, a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that while an enslaved person couldn't legally marry, if a master wished to legitimize children born to his enslaved woman, he would have to manumit the mother first, thus making the children freeborn. This highlights that legal personhood was a prerequisite for legal parentage, even for the master's own offspring. It's a strange legal loop, isn't it? Historians still argue whether the formal legal status of res thing was more dehumanizing than the practical realities of everyday violence and exploitation, or if the legal classification simply provided the justification for all the other abuses. Was the legal definition the cause, or just the codification of their suffering for you? As an enslaved person, the law offered no solace, no protection, and no hope. It merely confirmed your profound unfreedom, a constant reminder that you were a tool, not a human. Given the absolute lack of legal rights and the pervasive brutality, it's no surprise that enslaved people in the Roman Empire often chose resistance over submission, leading to dramatic rebellions and resistance. While your individual acts of defiance might be small, the collective efforts of thousands could shake the very foundations of the empire. Reminding Rome that even property could fight back, imagine the simmering resentment, the quiet desperation. That could ignite into open revolt. Roman history is punctuated by major slave rebellions, the most famous, of course, being the uprising led by Spartacus. These were not mere riots. They were large-scale military campaigns, terrifying to the Roman elite, proving that the vast enslaved population was a constant, volatile threat. You could be working quietly one day, and the next, find yourself swept up in a desperate, last-ditch fight for freedom, knowing the odds were stacked against you. It's like watching a seemingly docile volcano suddenly erupt with destructive force. Beyond these grand, often doomed rebellions, resistance manifested in countless, quieter ways. You might engage in passive resistance, working slowly, sabotaging tools or crops just enough to cause problems, not enough to get caught easily, pretending to be ill, or feigning ignorance. These were small acts of defiance, tiny chips at the edifice of power, designed to reclaim a sliver of agency and reduce your master's profits. However, minimally. It's a bit like an office worker deliberately taking extra long coffee breaks, but with far higher stakes. Running away was another common form of resistance, a desperate dash for freedom. You might attempt to flee to a remote area, seek refuge with sympathetic individuals, or try to blend into a bustling city where your identity might be obscured. While the odds of successful escape were low, Roman law heavily punished those who aided runaways, and slave catchers were employed. The dream of freedom was a powerful motivator, driving thousands to risk everything. Imagine the sheer terror and exhilaration of that desperate dash. Every shadow a potential pursuer, every sound a threat. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully embodies this resistance is, of course, the Spartacus Rebellion, 73-71 BCE. This was not just a minor uprising, it was a massive slave revolt that saw tens of thousands of enslaved people, primarily gladiators and rural laborers, defeat several Roman legions and wreak havoc across much of southern Italy for 2 years. The rebellion sent shockwaves through Roman society, demonstrating the immense danger posed by a unified enslaved population, and ultimately requiring the full force of the Roman military to crush it. The crucifixion of thousands of captured rebels along the Appian Way served as a brutal, unforgettable warning. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is the use of curses and magical tablets defictiones by enslaved people against their masters or other individuals who wronged them. These lead tablets, inscribed with curses and then deposited in graves or wells, represent a desperate supernatural form of resistance for those who had no other recourse. Imagine silently wishing a terrible fate upon your tormentor, believing that a hidden curse could bring about justice that earthly laws denied you. It's a poignant testament to their powerlessness and their enduring hope for retribution. Historians still argue whether the frequency and severity of slave rebellions ultimately had a significant impact on Roman policy towards slavery, leading to some reforms and a more cautious approach, or if they were largely seen as isolated incidents that did not fundamentally alter the institution until much later economic and social factors came into play. Did these revolts sow seeds of change? Or were they just brutal, temporary setbacks for the powerful for you, as an enslaved person witnessing or participating in resistance? It would be a dangerous dance between the flicker of hope for freedom and the crushing fear of brutal reprisal. You felt the weight of legal non-personhood and the desperation of resistance. Now, let's zoom out a bit and consider how this pervasive system of human bondage was understood, even justified, by the very people who benefited from it. This brings us to the complex and often contradictory philosophical views on slavery held by Roman thinkers. While we view slavery as an inherent evil today, many prominent Roman intellectuals, whose ideas influenced Western thought for centuries, found ways to rationalize and integrate it into their worldview. Imagine sitting in a Roman villa, listening to a philosopher like Cicero or Seneca discuss the nature of society. You might hear them speak eloquently about justice, liberty, and the duties of citizens. Yet, in the same breath, they would implicitly or explicitly accept the institution of slavery as a natural part of the established order. This wasn't because they were necessarily monstrous individuals, but because their philosophical frameworks often provided convenient justifications for the practice. For them, slavery was a given, a fact of life, and their intellectual efforts were typically directed at managing it, rather than abolishing it. It's like having brilliant minds creating the blueprint for a beautiful house, but just accepting that the foundations must be built with forced labor. One common philosophical argument was that some people were simply slaves by nature, servi natura, a concept borrowed from Greek philosophers like Aristotle. This idea posited that certain individuals lacked the capacity for self-governance or rational thought, and thus were naturally suited to be ruled by others. If you were conquered, if you were poor, if you were born into bondage. This philosophy provided a neat, albeit cruel, explanation for your status. It implied that your enslavement wasn't a misfortune, but a reflection of your inherent character. Another justification revolved around the concept of fortuna. If you were enslaved, it was simply your bad luck, a twist of fate, or the outcome of war. This perspective allowed Romans to avoid deeper moral contemplation, framing slavery as an unfortunate, but unavoidable, consequence of life's unpredictable turns. It shifted responsibility from the enslavers to the abstract forces of destiny. It's a bit like saying, well, the dice rolled that way, so tough luck. However, it wasn't entirely monolithic. Some Stoic philosophers, for example, while still operating within a slave-owning society, emphasized the concept of inner freedom. They argued that true slavery was a condition of the mind, a subjugation to one's passions and desires, while true freedom was found in virtue and rational self-control, regardless of one's external circumstances. So, an enslaved Stoic could theoretically be freer than an unvirtuous emperor. While this offered a psychological solace for some enslaved individuals, it didn't do much to change their legal or physical reality. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates this philosophical justification is Seneca the Younger's writings on the treatment of enslaved people. While Seneca, a prominent Stoic philosopher and advisor to Nero, certainly advocated for more humane treatment, arguing that enslaved people were still human beings and should not be cruelly abused. He never called for the abolition of slavery. His arguments for kindness were based on the master's moral character and the idea that benevolent treatment would foster loyalty, not on the inherent wrongness of the institution itself. He was concerned with the master's soul, not the enslaved person's freedom. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some Roman epitaphs for deceased enslaved individuals, particularly children, could sometimes express a genuine sorrow from their masters, using terms of endearment. Historians still argue whether these seemingly heartfelt inscriptions are genuine expressions of affection that complicate the monolithic view of Roman cruelty. Or if they were merely formulaic conventions designed to reflect well on the owner's public image and moral standing, were they truly expressions of love, or just very early forms of virtue signaling? This debate highlights the difficulty of discerning personal sentiment from public performance in ancient texts, while Roman philosophers grappled with profound ideas. Their intellectual frameworks almost always accommodated, rather than condemned, the widespread human bondage that powered their world. Their ideas offered little comfort to those who actually lived under the yoke of forced labor. You've delved into the deep, often dark, waters of what slavery was really like in the Roman Empire, from how individuals became enslaved to their varying experiences, their lack of rights, their acts of resistance, and the philosophical justifications that maintained the system. Now, as our journey through this challenging history concludes, let's consider the profound and often overlooked lasting impact of Roman slavery. This institution, which was so central to the empire, didn't simply vanish with its decline. Its legacy echoes through subsequent history, shaping social structures, economic systems, and even our understanding of freedom itself. Imagine the sheer scale of the human tragedy. Millions upon millions of lives lived in bondage, countless generations born and dying without autonomy. This massive, prolonged exploitation of human labor profoundly shaped the economic development of the Roman Empire. The reliance on enslaved labor meant that vast wealth accumulated in the hands of a few elite owners, contributing to extreme social inequality. It also, as we briefly discussed, may have stifled technological innovation in areas where cheap human labor was readily available. Why invent a machine to harvest grain when you have thousands of people forced to do it for free? The social legacy of Roman slavery was equally significant. The stark division between free and unfree fundamentally shaped Roman society, creating a rigid hierarchy that persisted even for freed people. The concept of freedom itself in Rome was often defined against the backdrop of slavery. To be free was simply to not be enslaved, a negative definition that highlighted the pervasive presence of bondage. This distinction influenced ideas about citizenship, social status, and personal dignity for centuries to come. Furthermore, the legal precedents and philosophical rationalizations developed in Rome to justify slavery had a long and insidious afterlife, while later societies might draw on different justifications. The Roman legal framework that defined human beings as property and the philosophical arguments about natural slavery provided powerful intellectual tools for the maintenance of various forms of forced labor in the centuries that followed, even influencing later European colonial systems. It's a chilling reminder of how ideas, even terrible ones, can persist and adapt across time and cultures. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this lasting impact is the development of Roman private law jus civile, this comprehensive legal system, a foundational influence on many modern legal codes, meticulously detailed the rights and obligations of masters regarding their enslaved property, while later legal traditions sought to abolish slavery. The very legal concepts of property ownership, contracts, and personal status, often developed in a context that included slavery, continued to evolve, sometimes carrying unintended echoes of that original institution. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that even the terminology we use today to discuss certain legal concepts like emancipation can have roots in Roman practices related to slavery and family law. The Latin word emancipatio referred to the act of freeing a son from the patria potestas, the absolute power of the father, a concept that shares a semantic kinship with the freeing of enslaved people. Highlighting how deeply intertwined these concepts of control and liberation were within Roman thought. Imagine our language still carrying the ghostly traces of an ancient institution of bondage. Historians still argue whether the eventual decline of slavery in the late Roman Empire and early Middle Ages was primarily due to economic shifts that made large-scale chattel slavery less profitable, or if it was the gradual influence of Christian moral teachings that slowly, but fundamentally, challenged the institution's ethical foundations. Was it economics or morality that finally chipped away at this immense structure, regardless of the precise cause of its eventual decline? The colossal shadow of Roman slavery stretched far beyond the empire's borders and centuries after its fall, reminding us of humanity's enduring capacity for both immense cruelty and the profound struggle for freedom. Now, let the echoes of ancient Roman chains, the murmurs of philosophers, and the shouts of gladiators fade into the soft hum of your surroundings. The dust of the Colosseum and the vast, sun-baked fields worked by countless hands are receding, becoming indistinct images in your mind's eye. There's no more struggle, no more relentless labor, no more harsh masters to fear here. Just the gentle rhythm of your own breath, the warmth of your blanket, and the quiet comfort of your room. You can release the weight of those ancient histories, knowing that the past is distant, and your present is safe and peaceful. Drift now, deeply and peacefully. End of script. Sweet dreams.